Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the channel where curiosity meets chronic drowsiness. Tonight, we're going somewhere warmer than your blanket, older than your regrets, and significantly worse at budgeting. Ancient Rome. Now, you've probably heard that Rome fell. Sounds dramatic, right? Flaming temples, screaming senators, a violin solo somewhere in the background. But no, Rome didn't crash and burn. It slowly misplaced itself. Over centuries, like a very proud person realizing one morning that they've been wearing their toga inside out since 300 AD. So if you enjoy history that moves slower than a Roman tax reform, hit that like button before you fall asleep doing it. And if you're new here, subscribe. Because nothing says self-care like listening to a calm stranger explain imperial mismanagement for 2 hours straight. Now, take a deep breath. The air smells faintly of olive oil, marble dust, and mild political corruption. Let's drift back to the height of the empire. When the world bowed to Rome, the aqueducts flowed like silver rivers, and the empire itself believed it could never end. Spoiler, it did, but very politely. The year is somewhere between glory and oops. The Mediterranean is calm, the roads are paved, and the legions march in perfect formation, mostly because their centurion will yell at them if they don't. Rome stretches from the sands of Egypt to the foggy edges of Britain, a network of stone, sweat, and taxes. From above, it looks eternal, the beating heart of civilization. From ground level, it's more like a noisy, overcrowded apartment complex that accidentally invented bureaucracy. Inside the city, marble temples gleam under the sun. Senators in white togas stroll through the forum, pretending to discuss philosophy, while actually gossiping about who's getting exiled next. Street vendors shout, coins clink, and somewhere in the distance, a poet is trying to get someone, anyone, to listen to his new epic. Rome feels unstoppable, and that's exactly when things start to crumble. The first cracks aren't in the marble, they're in the people. The empire has grown too large to understand itself. Messages take weeks to cross from one border to another. Armies fight wars the emperor hasn't even heard about yet. Governors misbehave. Treasurers misplace entire provinces worth of gold. And in the Senate, debates go on for hours over whether senators should be allowed to wear sandals during official sessions. It's democracy, but slower. Meanwhile, out on the frontier, the world is changing. Beyond the rivers and the mountains, tribes are moving. Goths, Vandals, Huns. Names that will one day make Roman children hide under their blankets. But for now, in the marble halls of power, nobody cares. The empire has seen worse, they say, which is technically true, but also the sort of sentence that ages poorly. Rome isn't falling, yet. It's just tired. Like an old man still insisting he can run a marathon because he once did, 3 centuries ago. The aqueducts still sparkle in the sun, the Colosseum still echoes with cheers, and the bread still arrives, mostly. But something beneath it all feels slower, heavier. The empire that once built roads straight as arrows now wanders in circles. The bureaucracy grows so tangled that officials start needing forms to request more forms. A simple tax report can take 2 years and 3 bribes. Even the gods seem distracted. Jupiter yawns, Mars taps his spear impatiently, and Venus wonders if she can get a transfer to somewhere less dramatic. But tonight, we're not here to rush the ending. We're here to drift through the gentle decay, to listen as the marble cracks softly under the weight of time. Imagine standing on a Roman street at dusk. The air is golden. The smell of baked bread and dust mingles with incense from a nearby temple. A senator's litter passes by, carried by sweating slaves. A child chases a dog through the crowd. And above it all, the capital glows in the last light of the setting sun. Calm, unbothered, and completely unaware that its best days are already behind it. Somewhere, in a small room, a scribe dips his pen into ink, copying the words of an imperial decree he doesn't quite understand. His hand trembles, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He's been writing laws all day, laws that change nothing. Outside, the Tiber flows on, carrying the reflections of temples and bridges that will one day be ruins. The river doesn't care. It's seen tribes, floods, and emperors come and go. It will see them all again. The funny thing about falling is that no one living through it realizes it's happening. To the people of Rome, life goes on. Markets open, soldiers march, poets complain about critics. The empire isn't ending, it's just another day. The only difference is that every day the city grows a little quieter, a little less certain, a little more hollow beneath the marble. But still, what a beautiful decline it is. So tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine that you're standing beneath the stars of the ancient world. The torches flicker. The marble glows faintly in the moonlight. Somewhere, a legionnaire snores in his barracks, dreaming of home. The empire sleeps, not yet fallen, just resting. And as the wind moves softly through the columns, you can almost hear it whisper. Rome wasn't built in a day, but it might take a few centuries to forget how to stand. Rome liked to call itself the Eternal City, and to be fair, it almost pulled it off. For centuries, its marble bones gleamed beneath the Italian sun, defying time, earthquakes, and every emperor who thought redecorating was a good idea. But by the late 4th century, something had changed. The empire wasn't dead, it was just napping. A very long, bureaucratic nap. The kind of nap you take when you're supposed to fix the roof, but the roof has been leaking since your grandfather's reign, and technically it's someone else's department. The city still looked magnificent from a distance. The aqueducts stretched like ribs across the hills, feeding the public bars where citizens floated in warm water, gossiping about politics they didn't understand. The Colosseum stood proud, though a few stones had begun to slide. Vendors still shouted, donkeys still brayed, and the Senate still argued over things that hadn't mattered since Julius Caesar had hair. Life went on, but it went on slower. The markets opened later and closed earlier. The baker, who once rose before dawn, now slept through sunrise. Farmers brought fewer carts of grain, and everywhere there was a faint sense that Rome had forgotten what all the noise was for. Even the statues looked tired. The marble gods who once gazed proudly over the forum now wore a thin coat of soot. Pigeons had claimed them as real estate, decorating Jupiter's head like a crown of feathers. Moss crept up the pillars. Fountains sputtered. The water still ran, but half the time it ran in the wrong direction. At the public baths, once the social heart of the empire, the water was tepid, the tiles cracked, and the hot rooms smelled faintly of mildew and disappointment. Yet the citizens kept coming, because Rome still believed that pretending everything was fine made it fine. Inside the Senate, the sound of sandals shuffling echoed through the marble hall. Dozens of old men in togas sat on benches, discussing. Well, no one was entirely sure anymore. They issued decrees about taxes no one paid, and honored provinces no one controlled. Every speech began with, "As our glorious empire continues to thrive," and ended with, "May the gods protect us from inflation." They were professionals at optimism. Occasionally, a messenger would burst in with bad news from the frontiers, some small rebellion, or a barbarian tribe asking if they could not be taxed to death this year. The senators nodded gravely, promised to form a committee, and then adjourned for lunch. Rome didn't fall because no one cared. It fell because everyone cared just enough to write about it later. Meanwhile, the emperors came and went like poorly reviewed restaurant owners. One week, there was Honorius, hiding behind palace walls while his generals did the actual work. Then came Valentinian, then Majorian, then a few whose names even their mothers probably forgot. Each one had grand plans: reform the army, fix the roads, stabilize the currency. But the treasury was empty, the soldiers were tired, and the roads, well, the roads were mostly being stolen, one stone at a time, to build nicer houses. By the time orders reached the provinces, months had passed. Some governors ignored them. Others couldn't read them. A few just sold the paper as kindling. Communication across the empire had become a game of broken telephone, only with fewer telephones and more civil wars. Out in the streets, daily life drifted on in slow motion. The baker's boys still shouted prices, but fewer customers came. The blacksmith hammered nails for wagons that rarely left town. Beggars lined the temples, where the priests still prayed loudly, though even the gods seemed to have reduced their office hours. In the evenings, the city glowed with lamplight. From the Palatine Hill, the rooftops shimmered like a field of stars. But if you listened closely, you could hear the silence between the sounds, that heavy, hollow quiet that settles over something once loud and alive. It wasn't sadness, not yet, just a kind of ancient fatigue. Travelers who came to Rome in these years often wrote about its beauty and its decay in the same breath. The stones are divine, one said, but the people are asleep. And they were, in spirit, at least. The ambition that once carved empires from wilderness now carved initials into walls. The engineers who built aqueducts became caretakers of leaks. The generals who conquered nations now fought paperwork. Rome wasn't a roaring lion anymore. It was a big, slightly confused house cat sitting in the sun, convinced it was still hunting. There were still moments of glory, of course. Festivals where the streets filled with flowers and parades marched past the old temples. Children laughed, musicians played, and for a moment, the city looked like itself again, proud, vibrant, alive. But when the songs ended, the dust settled, and the banners came down, the silence returned heavier than before. The eternal city, it seemed, was quietly drifting towards something it didn't have a word for: stillness. As the night deepened, the lamps burned low. Somewhere, a legionary on watch leaned against his spear, staring at the stars and wondering if the world had always been this quiet. In a nearby alley, a cat darted between shadows, its paws stirring centuries of dust. Beyond the city walls, the dark hills waited. On the other side of those hills were people, farmers, soldiers, kings, who looked toward Rome not with awe anymore, but with opportunity. The empire had been great for so long that it forgot greatness was something you had to keep doing. And yet, there's something peaceful in that. In the moonlight, Rome's ruins to be glimmer like sleeping giants. The wind sighs through the columns, carrying the faint scent of olive and ash. The Tiber murmurs softly as it slides past broken docks. The city is tired, but not gone. It's dreaming of triumphs, of legions, of marble laughter echoing across time. So as you close your eyes, picture it not falling, but resting. Because before Rome collapsed, it exhaled. And the world has been listening to that breath ever since. If you've ever worked at a company where management changes every 6 months, congratulations. You already understand the 3rd century Roman Empire. This was the age historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, which sounds dramatic until you realize it lasted about 50 years, meaning Rome spent half a century trying to remember who was technically in charge. Between the years 235 and 284 AD, the empire saw more than 26 emperors. That's an emperor roughly every 2 years, or in ancient Roman terms, about 1 emperor per tax reform. Some ruled for years, others for weeks. 1 or 2 didn't even make it through lunch. It wasn't so much a dynasty as it was a high-stakes game of musical chairs. Except the chairs were thrones. The music was the sound of marching armies, and if you lost, your retirement plan involved being quietly stabbed near a fountain. The first problem was geography. The empire was too big to manage, a glorious, sprawling mess stretching from the Scottish fog to the Egyptian sand. Imagine trying to run an empire where your email takes 4 months to arrive by horse, and half the people reading it don't speak Latin anymore. So when trouble started brewing on the edges, rebellions, invasions, a plague or 2, the emperor couldn't be everywhere at once. Governors and generals decided, why wait for instructions when we could just be the emperor ourselves? And so, one after another, they crowned themselves, issued coins with their faces, and waited to see if anyone objected. Usually someone did. Usually it was fatal. But for the average Roman citizen, life went on, confusing but unchanged. The baker didn't care whose name was on the coins as long as they bought bread. The soldiers didn't mind who paid them as long as someone did. And the gods, well, the gods probably stopped keeping track altogether. One poet of the time joked that he kept his portrait of the emperor in soft clay, so he could easily reshape it when the next one took over. It was meant as humor, but it was also practical advice. Each emperor promised stability. None delivered. There was Gordian, who lasted a few weeks before discovering that rebellion is easier to start than to finish. Then came Philip the Arab, Decius, Gallienus, Claudius the Goth-slayer. Names that sound heroic until you realize their biographies read like the same tragic script on repeat. Rose to power, fought bravely, betrayed by his own men. Even the gods must have gotten tired of updating their spreadsheets. At one point, 3 different emperors claimed the throne simultaneously. Rome had become its own group project, full of ambition, confusion, and passive-aggressive letters sealed with wax. To keep order, emperors threw everything at the problem. New taxes, new borders, new gods. One even declared himself divine, hoping it might make his soldiers take orders more seriously. Spoiler, it didn't. Another emperor built giant walls to keep the barbarians out, which worked until someone realized barbarians could walk around them. One tried paying his enemies not to invade. That worked too, until he ran out of money and the enemies sent an invoice with interest. The empire wasn't collapsing yet, but it was wobbling, like a marble statue balanced on one leg. Graceful, impressive, and one pigeon away from disaster. And yet, in all the chaos, something strangely human shone through. Each emperor, delusional, desperate, or briefly brilliant, truly believed he could fix it, that he was the one chosen by fate to restore Rome's greatness. For a while, some almost did. Aurelian, for example, reunited the empire after it had split apart like a bad family dinner. He brought back order, rebuilt defenses, even introduced ration reforms. People started to believe again. They called him Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. Then someone assassinated him, because of course they did. Afterward, his secretary reportedly confessed it was all a clerical error. The man had misread a document and thought the emperor planned to execute him. He didn't, until the secretary killed him first. Bureaucracy, as always, was deadly. Through it all, the empire somehow kept functioning. The roads still carried traders, the baths still steamed, the taxes, miraculously, still found their way to the capital. Although by now, about half of it arrived missing a few bags. It was as though Rome's sheer inertia kept it alive, like a great stone wheel rolling downhill, slow, unstoppable, and slightly dangerous to anyone in its path. Historians often call this era the beginning of the end, but that's not quite fair. It was more like the middle of a very long sigh. When night fell on the city, the torchlight flickered on the faces of statues that no longer matched anyone in power. The people walked past them without noticing. They had seen too many faces come and go to care which one was carved in stone. In the taverns, men whispered about the latest rebellion. Some said the emperor was dead again. Others said he'd simply gone on vacation. No one really knew, and no one seemed surprised. The only constant left was Rome itself, still vast, still proud, still pretending to be eternal. And maybe that's what kept it alive for so long. Even when the emperors fell, even when the gold ran thin and the soldiers lost faith, the idea of Rome endured. The marble might crack, but the myth, that shining, impossible belief in civilization, stayed standing. So as you drift deeper into the empire's dream, imagine those flickering torches, those worn statues staring out over silent streets. The emperors may come and go, but the stones remember them all, patiently, indifferently, as only stone can. Rome doesn't fall tonight. It just closes its eyes for a moment and lets another emperor fade quietly into the dark. If there was one thing the Romans understood, it was public relations. When the people were restless, the emperors didn't hold press conferences or issue thoughtful apologies. They handed out snacks and entertainment. It was a strategy so simple it should be printed on a pillow. Keep them fed, keep them distracted. Or as one cynical poet put it, panem et circenses, bread and circuses. It worked brilliantly until it didn't. Every morning, thousands of citizens shuffled into the forum to collect their daily grain allowance. Each family was entitled to a measured portion of wheat, enough to bake bread, or at least to pretend to. The system was designed to keep everyone alive and loyal, but over time, it also made the people dependent. The empire fed its citizens, and in return, they tried not to riot. It was a delicate agreement, sort of like giving your cat treats so it doesn't scratch the furniture. But when the grain ships from Egypt were delayed by storms, pirates, or incompetent administrators who forgot which port to use, panic spread faster than gossip. The Roman crowd could tolerate many things: taxes, corruption, even emperors who thought they were gods. But take away their bread, and suddenly, democracy started to look tempting again. Luckily, Rome had a secret weapon: the games. The Colosseum, that enormous ring of stone and sand, was less a sports arena and more an emotional pressure valve for an empire slowly coming apart at the seams. On any given afternoon, 50,000 people could gather there to forget their problems. The poor came for the spectacle, the rich came for status, and the emperor came to look merciful while watching tigers chase people who owed him money. It was the ancient equivalent of reality television, loud, messy, and oddly therapeutic. Before each show, a parade entered the arena. Priests with incense, musicians with trumpets, and occasionally an elephant wearing more gold than an entire province could afford. Then the games began. Gladiators fought, chariots raced, and the crowd roared until even the marble trembled. For a few hours, Rome believed in itself again. The noise drowned out the whispers of famine, rebellion, and unpaid soldiers. The people cheered, and for that brief moment, everything felt fine. But beneath the roar, something hollow grew. The same citizens who once built roads across continents now spent their days gambling on which man with a sword would last longer. When you trade civic duty for entertainment, it feels good, until the show ends and the empire is still falling apart outside the gates. In the quieter corners of the city, a few philosophers started to notice. Stoics like Seneca had already warned centuries earlier that pleasure was a poor substitute for purpose. But by the late empire, hardly anyone was reading philosophy. Why ponder the fragility of civilization when you could watch a bear ride a horse? Even the emperors got hooked. Commodus, yes, the one from Gladiator, though less handsome, loved performing in the arena himself. He dressed like Hercules, fought half-trained opponents, and made sure everyone clapped. He once announced that he had killed 1,000 beasts with his own hand. Historians suspect the beasts were unusually cooperative. The crowd applauded anyway, because pretending was safer than telling the truth. Outside the Colosseum, life was changing. The aqueducts ran slower. The baths grew colder. The streets filled with beggars and stray dogs. But inside the arena, under the blazing sun, the illusion of greatness remained. The emperors had discovered the power of distraction, and they wielded it masterfully. Whenever plague broke out, they scheduled a week of chariot races. Whenever a tax increase angered the merchants, they announced free bread for all. And whenever a general returned from losing half the army, they held a triumph parade anyway. If you decorate failure with enough trumpets, it looks like victory. One Roman writer called his people a nation that has forgotten how to blush. He meant that Rome no longer cared how absurd it looked, as long as the game started on time. Even when the empire's treasury ran dry, the emperors borrowed from temples to fund new spectacles. Lions were imported from Africa, crocodiles from Egypt, even hippos, though no one ever figured out what to do with a hippo in a gladiator match. The people didn't ask where the money came from. They just wanted another show. Yet, somewhere among the crowds, a quiet voice must have wondered, how long can this last? When the bread runs out, when the circuses stop, when the laughter fades, what's left of an empire built on applause? For centuries, Rome's strength had come from purpose, building, conquering, organizing. Now its strength came from pretending. The marble was still white, the banners still bright, the music still loud. But the soul of the empire was sitting in the cheap seats, wondering if anyone remembered why they started cheering in the first place. As the sun set over the Colosseum, the crowds drifted home through dusty streets. The city was quiet again, the stones cooling in the night air. Somewhere, a torch flickered against the walls, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts of forgotten triumphs. A child held the hand of his father, asking when the next games would be. The father smiled wearily and said, "Soon." He didn't know that soon was the story of the empire now. Everything postponed, everything almost fine. The wind carried the faint echo of applause into the dark, soft, distant, and strangely sad. Bread and circuses had kept the people happy, but happiness, like empires, has an expiration date. So, as you drift deeper into sleep, imagine that silence after the crowd is gone. The sand still warm, the torches dying out, the marble sighing in the dark. the show is over. The empire rests. And somewhere deep beneath the dust, the heartbeat of Rome slows just a little more. By the 4th century, the Roman Empire had a neighbor problem. Not the kind where someone borrows your tools and forgets to return them. More the kind where entire tribes start camping on your borders with suspiciously large swords. To the Romans, these people were simply barbarians, not because they were particularly cruel, but because their languages sounded like bar to Roman ears, which, to be fair, is roughly how Latin sounded to everyone else. At first, the empire looked down from its marble balconies and thought, they'll never get in. Then, a few decades later, they're definitely getting in. And finally, technically, they now own the balcony. The trouble began far away, on the windswept plains of Central Asia. There, a group called the Huns decided that horseback archery was fun, and that everyone else's homeland looked slightly better than theirs. As they galloped west, they didn't just invade, they migrated. And when the Huns pushed westward, other tribes, the Goths, Vandals and Franks, started moving too, like dominoes made of very determined people. Soon, the Roman frontier along the Rhine and Danube began to shake. Now, to be fair, Rome had seen invasions before. They were used to barbarians showing up, waving spears, and being politely defeated. But this time was different. These newcomers weren't raiders. They were refugees. Whole nations on the move. Farmers, children, old men with wagons full of everything they owned. They didn't want to destroy Rome. They wanted to join it. And that's where the trouble really started. The empire that had once swallowed continents now struggled to digest its own guests. Generals debated what to do. Some said, let them in, they'll make good soldiers. Others said, absolutely not, they'll make good soldiers against us. Rome, ever indecisive, chose both. They invited the Goths to settle in the Balkans, promised them land, and then, in classic Roman fashion, forgot to actually pay or feed them. Starving and angry, the Goths revolted, and in 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, they annihilated a Roman army and killed the emperor himself. It was the kind of wake-up call that should have made Rome panic. Instead, they filled out some paperwork and went back to arguing about tax policy. Still, even bureaucracies learn eventually. Rome began hiring barbarians as federati, allied soldiers under contract. It sounded clever. Let them fight for us instead of against us. In practice, it was like hiring wolves to guard your sheep. They did a great job, right up until payday. By the 5th century, entire Roman legions were made up of Germanic soldiers who didn't speak Latin, didn't care about the Senate, and occasionally declared their own general emperor just to see what would happen. And yet, life inside the city remained strangely calm. If you were a baker, a merchant, or a poet, you probably didn't notice that half the empire's army was now technically freelance. You might hear rumors of battles far away, but they sounded more like stories than warnings. After all, Rome had been invincible for centuries. Why should now be any different? The empire was like a man asleep in a burning villa. The smoke thickening, the flames spreading, but the bed just so comfortable. But history, like death, eventually comes knocking. And sometimes it knocks politely, before kicking down the door. In 410 AD, the Visigoths, led by King Alaric, marched right into Italy. They'd been promised peace, food, and friendship, but the Senate delivered only delays. After years of broken treaties, they decided to collect their payment in person. They surrounded Rome, the city that hadn't been taken by a foreign enemy in nearly 800 years. Inside, panic spread. Some blamed the pagans for angering the old gods. Others blamed the Christians for abandoning them. The truth was simpler. No one had paid the army. The siege dragged on for months. Food ran out. People starved. And on a warm August night, a gate was opened. Maybe by bribery, maybe by mistake. And the Visigoths entered the Eternal City. They didn't burn it to the ground. They didn't destroy it out of hatred. They looted it calmly, methodically, like a moving company with axes. They took gold, silver, and anything shiny. They broke open wine cellars. They carried off noble women and ancient statues. But they also left the churches untouched, a sign, perhaps, that even conquerors respected the sacred. For 3 days, the greatest city on earth was silent, except for the sound of boots, shouts, and falling marble. When the Visigoths finally left, Rome still stood, but emptier, older, and infinitely sadder. News of the sack rippled through the empire like a cold wind. Saint Jerome wrote from Bethlehem, "The light of the world has gone out." Others called it the end of civilization itself. But Rome somehow survived. It always did. The people swept the streets, patched the walls, and went back to their routines, as though pretending could still make it eternal. The baker baked, the senators schemed, and the poets tried to turn tragedy into art. Even in ruins, the city refused to die. Still, something had changed forever. The barbarians hadn't just broken the walls. They'd broken the illusion, the belief that Rome was untouchable. The world beyond the empire no longer looked up to Rome. It looked at it, the way one might look at a rich, aging neighbor whose locks no longer work. And soon enough, more visitors would arrive. The Vandals, the Huns, the Lombards, each knocking a little less politely than the last. But that's for another night. For now, imagine the city after the storm. Quiet, bruised, its marble streets glimmering faintly under the moon. The smoke drifts away, the Tiber whispers against its banks, and somewhere, an old statue of Jupiter tilts slightly in the dark, as if bowing to time itself. The Eternal City sleeps again, lighter by a few treasures, heavier by a few ghosts. And the wind that passes through its gates seems to whisper one word: inevitable. By the 5th century, the Roman Empire had become the world's most complicated group chat. Messages were sent from distant governors, generals, and tax collectors, each with their own urgent problems. But by the time they reached the emperor, the news was months old and often irrelevant. If you've ever replied "no worries" to an email that's already been solved, you've basically ruled late Rome. Communication was slow, politics slower, and morale somewhere between stale bread and wet toga. Imagine it. You're an emperor sitting in Ravenna, the empire's new capital, chosen because it's surrounded by swamps, which is great for defense and terrible for morale. Your empire stretches thousands of kilometers, and every day messengers arrive with scrolls sealed in wax. They carry updates about revolts, grain shortages, suspicious barbarians, unpaid soldiers, and the occasional reminder that the aqueduct in Gaul still leaks. You open the letters one by one. Each starts with flattery. "O radiant Lord of the earth, defender of civilization, light of the world," followed by, "Also, the treasury has been robbed again." You sigh. You dip your pen in ink. You write a reply that begins, "Fix this immediately," and ends with, "May the gods bless you." Then you hand it to a courier who will take 3 months to deliver it, to someone who will likely be dead by then. The empire's bureaucracy had once been its superpower. Now it was its sleep aid. There were offices for everything: grain, taxes, temples, postal routes, even an official department for divine paperwork. One historian wrote that there were so many secretaries in Rome, it was impossible to walk down a corridor without tripping over one. The administrators worked tirelessly, drafting reports no one read, signing orders no one followed, and stamping seals on decisions that changed nothing. It was like watching a man rearrange deck chairs on a galley that hadn't left port in decades. And yet, it wasn't incompetence. Not exactly. It was exhaustion. For centuries, the empire had stretched its systems to hold together dozens of cultures, languages, and laws. Now it was simply too much to track. Each province wanted attention. Each governor wanted autonomy. And like any overworked boss, the emperor tried delegation. He divided the empire into smaller regions, each with their own mini-emperor, co-emperor, or assistant to the emperor. It sounded brilliant on parchment. In practice, it was like giving every branch of government its own Wi-Fi password, and then forgetting who changed it last. Soon, the East and the West were barely on speaking terms. The Eastern Empire, based in Constantinople, had money, ships, and a decent work ethic. The Western Empire had nostalgia. Meanwhile, soldiers along the frontiers sent desperate letters asking for reinforcements. They rarely got a reply. One general complained that his men hadn't been paid in 2 years, but the Treasury Office responded that, due to unforeseen circumstances, meaning the treasury was empty, payment will be slightly delayed. It's hard to inspire loyalty with overdraft notices. Some troops went rogue and started collecting their own taxes from nearby villages. Others simply switched sides, joining whichever barbarian leader offered better wages and warmer blankets. And while the borders frayed, inside the cities, things became strangely peaceful, in a bored, end-of-empire kind of way. Public work slowed, the baths grew colder, but the people still gathered in the markets each morning, gossiping about rumors from far-off provinces. No one really understood what was happening beyond the horizon, and the news, when it came, sounded unreal. The Vandals have taken Carthage. The Goths are in Gaul. The Emperor has moved again, something about better weather. Every headline felt distant, like hearing your childhood home burn down, but you haven't lived there in years. In the grand halls of administration, marble floors echoed under the sandals of tired clerks. They still carried scrolls from office to office, bowing to supervisors, muttering about ink shortages, but the air smelled faintly of mildew and resignation. The empire had once been a machine, efficient, magnificent, unstoppable. Now it was a ghost still running on the momentum of memory. One chronicler described it best. The state functions, but no one remembers why. Still, Rome refused to admit defeat. New decrees were issued constantly. Repair the roads, restore the aqueducts, punish corruption. Each one written on crisp parchment, each one completely ignored. And whenever someone pointed out that the system wasn't working, another committee was formed to investigate why the previous committee hadn't solved it. Bureaucracy, Rome's true religion, had outlived the gods themselves. In this fog of paperwork, one figure occasionally stood out: Diocletian. He was the emperor who finally realized that trying to run the entire empire alone was like trying to carry a bathtub full of grapes uphill. So he split the empire in two, east and west, and appointed co-emperors to share the burden. He standardized taxes, reorganized armies, even capped prices on luxury goods. For a while it worked. The empire steadied, the borders held, people actually got paid. Then Diocletian retired voluntarily, the first emperor ever to do so. He moved to a seaside palace and spent the rest of his life growing cabbages. When later asked to return to power, he laughed and said, "If you could see my vegetables, you'd never ask me that." Even emperors, it seems, dream of simpler lives. But after Diocletian, the empire slipped again into confusion, like a man waking from a nap and forgetting what century it is. The Eastern Empire thrived. The Western Empire started buffering. The paperwork kept moving, the wax seals kept stamping, and the couriers kept riding. All while the empire beneath them quietly unraveled. By now, no one could tell if Rome was collapsing or just lagging. It was the world's first civilization in need of a password reset, frozen between still working and please try again later. And so, as you drift deeper into this quiet, fading world, imagine those lonely scribes under the flicker of oil lamps, their ink drying on scrolls destined never to be read. Outside, the wind moves through broken arches. A single candle burns on the emperor's desk, its flame bending in the draught of a cracked window. Somewhere in the distance, a courier rides into the night, carrying one more message no one will answer. If Rome's armies conquered the world, its accountants lost it. Once upon a time, the empire was rich, absurdly rich. Gold from Spain, silver from Britain, spices from India, silk from China. Ships crowded the harbors of Ostia, unloading treasures that sparkled in the Mediterranean sun. And for a while, everyone believed the flow would never stop. That was Rome's greatest delusion. Not pride, not war, but the comforting lie that prosperity was permanent. At the heart of it all was the Roman coin, the denarius, a small silver disc stamped with the emperor's face and the promise of value. It wasn't just money, it was identity. Each coin said, "You are part of something vast and eternal." Then, slowly, the silver started disappearing. To pay the legions, rebuild the walls, and fund increasingly ridiculous festivals. Bring me 200 lions and a golden giraffe. Emperors began cutting corners, literally. They melted down old coins and mixed in cheaper metals, reissuing them with the same imperial smile, but half the value. It was the ancient version of printing money, only shinier and more optimistic. At first, nobody noticed. The coins still gleamed, the market still buzzed. But when bakers started demanding twice as many coins for the same loaf of bread, people began to suspect the emperor's face was worth less than it used to be. Inflation spread like mildew. Merchants began hoarding real silver. Soldiers demanded payment in gold instead of bronze. And soon, money itself stopped meaning much. Rome had conquered the world, but lost track of its receipts. Meanwhile, the empire's expenses grew. Armies on every frontier, forts, roads, palaces, and more palaces. Each new emperor wanted to outshine the last. Marble, mosaics, monuments, all paid for with coins that were, by now, mostly tin with ambition. To fund it all, taxes were raised again and again. Peasants sold their land to pay them. Cities drained their treasuries. And when that wasn't enough, the state started collecting taxes in whatever form people could offer. Grain, sheep, or in at least one desperate case, kitchenware. Rome had invented the world's first garage sale economy. In the countryside, the farmers were the first to break. They couldn't afford their taxes, but they couldn't escape them either. So they started attaching themselves to rich landowners, trading freedom for protection. It was the quiet beginning of feudalism, not born in castles and kings, but in desperation and debt. The empire had always relied on its middle class of small farmers and merchants. Now that class was dissolving like copper in vinegar. And the cities, once bursting with wealth, they began to hollow out. Public buildings fell into disrepair. The fountains stopped flowing. The grand marble baths, once a symbol of civilization, became cold, dry halls echoing with footsteps and memory. The smell of wet plaster replaced the scent of incense. Even the Colosseum, that mighty monument to imperial glory, began to crumble. The state could no longer afford repairs, so citizens quietly stole the marble, using it to build their own houses. Rome was literally recycling itself to survive. Trade routes, too, began to fade. Pirates prowled the Mediterranean. Roads cracked and filled with weeds. Once, goods could move from Syria to Spain in safety. Now merchants traveled in guarded caravans, whispering prayers to whatever god still accepted bribes. The empire's great arteries were clogging, and with them, its lifeblood, gold. In desperation, emperors tried everything. They imposed price controls, banning anyone from charging more than a set amount for grain, shoes, or candles. Naturally, no one obeyed. They banned the export of gold, declared debt forgiveness, even tried to replace money entirely with mandatory labor taxes, as if asking people to build roads for free would somehow make them love the empire again. It didn't. Each reform arrived too late, like patching a sinking ship with good intentions. The rich, of course, survived just fine. While farmers starved, senators buried their wealth, literally. Archaeologists today still find their hoards, jars of coins hidden under floors, sealed for safety that never came. The empire became two worlds, one of luxury villas with fountains still running, and one of empty villages where people had forgotten what coins were even for. When gold disappears, people start trading trust instead, and trust was in short supply. By the 5th century, even the army, that great machine of Roman power, was bankrupt. Soldiers who once fought for glory now fought for whoever fed them. Some were paid in land, others in promises. Others weren't paid at all. The empire was running on borrowed loyalty, and you can only borrow that for so long. But even as the coins turned dull, the empire's dream still gleamed. In taverns and temples, people still said Rome will rise again. Because how do you admit that something eternal has gone broke? Picture it now, a city at dusk, coins clinking faintly in the hands of a market seller. The metal looks silver, but the light betrays it. Dull grey, worn smooth by too many fingers, too many hopes. The baker closes his stall, counting coins he knows won't stretch till morning. In the palace, the emperor signs another decree to fix the economy. One more scroll in a pile that reaches the ceiling. Outside, the Tiber glows red with sunset, and for a moment, Rome looks rich again. But it's only the light. The gold is gone. The empire is still pretending. And as the night settles over the marble and the dust, you can almost hear it. The faint clatter of coins that no longer buy anything. The last echo of an empire trying to convince itself it's still valuable. A whisper of silver dreams fading into bronze reality. For centuries, Rome was never alone. Every doorway had a spirit, every river a god, every kitchen a small household deity whose job was to keep the soup from burning and the children from sticking forks in the thunderclouds. The Romans didn't just believe in gods, they collected them. When they conquered a new land, they didn't destroy the local deities, they invited them to join the team. Egyptian gods, Greek gods, Persian gods, the more the merrier. By the height of the empire, Rome had more shrines than sensible plumbing. Religion was less about faith and more about paperwork. You offered wine to Jupiter for success, grain to Ceres for harvest, and a small bronze coin to Mercury for good Wi-Fi, or whatever counted as Wi-Fi in the 2nd century. It was a divine transaction system, and as long as everyone kept paying their spiritual taxes, the gods were content. But by the 4th century, the system was breaking down. The temples were still standing, the incense still burned, but the crowds had thinned. The old prayers were fading like worn inscriptions, still visible but hard to read. Something new was stirring. In the quiet corners of the empire, another faith had taken root, small at first, whispered among slaves and merchants. A belief in one God instead of many. A God who didn't demand wine or sacrifices, just belief. It sounded odd in a world built on ritual, but odd things grow fast in tired soil. At first, the emperors ignored it. Christianity was seen as another eccentric cult, like the ones that worshipped cats or claimed the world would end next Tuesday. But the Christians were stubborn. They refused to burn incense for the emperor, refused to attend the official games, refused to participate in the divine bureaucracy that had kept Rome balanced for centuries. And worst of all, they refused to stop talking about it. So the empire, being the empire, decided to fix the problem the Roman way, with persecution, paperwork, and public executions. For over 200 years, the state tried to stamp them out, but for every Christian who died in an arena, 3 more joined the faith. You can't threaten people with death when they've already made peace with it. Then came Constantine, an emperor with ambition, charisma, and a fondness for dramatic conversions. In 312 AD, before a battle for control of the empire, he reportedly looked up at the sky and saw a glowing cross with the words, "In this sign, conquer." He did. He won. And then he made Christianity legal. Just like that, the empire that once crucified Christians now funded their churches. Bishops replaced priests. Cathedrals rose beside temples. And in the smoky back rooms of history, the old gods began quietly packing their bags. Some resisted, of course. The philosopher Julian, later called the Apostate, tried to bring them back. He reopened the temples, restored the priesthoods, and ordered sacrifices once more. He even wrote essays titled "Why the Old Gods Are Better," which is the ancient equivalent of yelling on the internet. It didn't work. After his death, the old religion faded faster than incense smoke. The temples closed. Statues were toppled or repurposed. Zeus became marble dust. Venus lost her funding. Rome had switched gods like changing an official logo, but change, as always, is rarely clean. For generations, the 2 faiths lived uneasily side by side. Some Romans prayed to Christ in the morning and to Jupiter in the afternoon, just in case. Old festivals were rebranded. Saturnalia became Christmas's loud cousin, and spring fertility rites quietly turned into Easter, now with fewer goats. Even the language of faith changed slowly. The word paganus originally just meant country person, but as Christianity spread through the cities, it came to mean anyone who still believed in the old ways, literally a villager. Faith had gone urban. Meanwhile, the temples themselves began to crumble. Without donations, marble cracked, roofs caved in, and vines crept up the columns. The gods, it seemed, had retired to the countryside, or at least to better-kept ruins. A traveller walking through the Forum in the 5th century might have seen priests sweeping empty courtyards, offering prayers to altars no one visited anymore. The wind rustled through weeds growing between the paving stones. Once, these temples had echoed with music and chanting. Now, they whispered back nothing. But not all the old spirits vanished. Some simply changed uniforms. The goddess Diana became associated with the Virgin Mary. Jupiter's thunder morphed into the wrath of heaven. Even household gods, the Lares and Penates, found new life as Christian saints, still guarding kitchens and doorways, just with better marketing. Rome hadn't really lost its gods. It had merged them. For the average Roman, the shift was gentle. The incense smelled the same. The hymns sounded similar. The new prayers were written in the same soft Latin rhythm that had always filled the air. But beneath the familiarity, something profound had changed. For the first time, people didn't have to negotiate with the divine. They could simply belong to it. Faith had moved from the marketplace to the heart, and yet the city missed its old noise. Even as churches rose, the silence of the vanished gods lingered. The great statues were gone, but their shadows stayed, long and graceful in the moonlight, carved into memory. If you walked through the ruins at dusk, you might feel it, that faint ache of something divine still waiting, patient as marble dust. The gods didn't fall. They faded, not with thunder or vengeance, but with the soft dignity of things that know when their time is done. And as the bells of new churches began to ring across the hills, the last echoes of Jupiter's thunder rolled quietly away, into the distance, into the clouds, into myth. End of chapter 8. When God started leaving too. Would you like me to continue with chapter 9? Splitting the check, east versus west. Next, 800 words. Yazai, yes. ChatGPT Zai, excellent. Here's chapter 9. Splitting the check, east versus west. 800 words. Continuing the soft, witty, and slightly melancholic rhythm of boring history for sleep. This chapter drifts through the empire's most awkward divorce. The moment when Rome decided two empires were better than one, and learned it wasn't. Chapter 9, Splitting the check. East versus West. There comes a point in every relationship when one person says, maybe we should take a break. For the Roman Empire, that moment came around the year 285 AD, after centuries of shared victories, emotional baggage, and mutual financial ruin. They didn't call it a breakup. They called it administrative reform. But let's be honest, it was a divorce. The empire had simply gotten too big for one person to manage. It stretched from the misty moors of Britain to the blazing deserts of Egypt, an impossible distance to rule with parchment, horses, and hope. Emperor Diocletian, ever the practical man, looked at the map and said what every exhausted ruler eventually thinks: I need help. So he split the empire in half. The Western Roman Empire would rule from Italy. The Eastern Roman Empire, soon to be called Byzantium, would rule from a glittering new capital, Constantinople. It was like Rome cloning itself. Only one version got the nice house, and the other got the repair bills. At first, it worked beautifully. Two emperors meant twice the paperwork, twice the titles, and double the number of statues carved in flattering poses. But it also meant faster decision-making, safer borders, and slightly fewer assassination attempts per capita. The East handled trade, philosophy, and architecture. The West handled invasions, inflation, and existential dread. It was a fair division of labor. If you asked, the East. Constantinople, the new city, was dazzling. Built on the site of the old Greek colony Byzantium, it rose like a mirage above the Bosphorus. Its walls were taller, its harbour deeper, its mosaics shinier than anything Rome had left. It was a city designed not just to impress, but to last. And it did, for 1,000 years. Inside, scholars copied books, priests debated theology, and merchants sold silk and spices from half the world. It was a city that believed in tomorrow. Meanwhile, in the West, Rome was quietly running out of tomorrows. Italy, once the empire's heart, was now its fragile ribcage. The countryside was scarred by war, the cities decaying. Taxes were high, morale low, and barbarian visitors increasingly frequent. The Senate, still technically in charge, spent most of its time composing elegant speeches about stability while standing on the deck of a sinking ship. If Constantinople was a young, ambitious graduate with a bright future, Rome was the aging relative who still insisted everything was fine, while using a broken amphora as a chair. The two halves stayed polite for a while. They sent each other envoys, exchanged gifts, and pretended to coordinate. But beneath the courtesies, tension brewed. The East was rich, efficient, and smug. The West was broke, chaotic, and proud. Whenever the Western Empire asked for help, troops, ships, or, ideally, cash, the East would send a carefully worded letter beginning with "Dear valued partner" and ending with "Best of luck with your barbarian problem." The barbarians, for their part, appreciated the teamwork. Culture began to split too. In the West, people still spoke Latin, worshipped in Latin, argued in Latin, and occasionally wept in Latin. In the East, Greek was making a comeback, elegant, philosophical, and ever so slightly passive-aggressive. The two halves started seeing the world differently. The East saw itself as the brain, refined, learned, divinely guided. The West saw itself as the muscle, practical, traditional, holding the line. You could almost hear the therapy session. "So," said Constantinople, "how does that make you feel?" "Poor," said Rome. "It makes me feel poor." And poor it was. Gold from the East no longer flowed westward. Trade routes shifted toward the rich ports of the Aegean and away from the crumbling harbours of Italy and Gaul. Even the great Roman army was being divided, and most of the better-trained legions conveniently ended up in the East. The Western Empire became the older sibling who stayed behind to look after the family business, only to realize the family business was dead. But even in decline, the West still had its pride. Rome was more than marble and money. It was memory, a feeling, an idea, a ghost that refused to leave the room. The senators in their threadbare togas still spoke of destiny, of divine favor, of the eternal city that could never truly fall. They believed that as long as Rome existed in name, the world still made sense. And maybe, for a while, that was true. Yet, as decades passed, the two Romes grew apart. The East prospered, the West struggled. When invasions came, Constantinople sent polite condolences but little else. When the Western capital finally moved from Rome to Ravenna, a swampy, defensible backwater, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. The Eternal City had quietly retired. By the 5th century, the divorce was final. The East would go on to become the Byzantine Empire. Elegant, complicated, and occasionally smug about surviving another 1,000 years. The West would stumble toward its quiet end, bankrupt, besieged, and still writing beautiful speeches about greatness. And though they shared a name, they no longer shared a destiny. The world had split, not just politically, but spiritually. Two Romes, two futures. So tonight, as you drift into that gentle twilight between dreams, imagine them both. To the east, Constantinople gleaming beneath its golden domes, ships gliding through the harbour, lamps flickering along marble streets. To the west, old Rome asleep beneath the moon, the Tiber whispering over fallen stones, the air heavy with memory. One looks ahead, one looks back, and somewhere between them, the empire's heart, still beating softly, still whispering the same word it always did: eternal. By the early 5th century, Rome had entered its please don't touch anything its vintage phase. The empire was still technically standing, but it had that delicate museum-like quality. Impressive to look at, but definitely not built for stress. And then, of course, came the visitors. They didn't arrive with postcards or good intentions. They came with wagons, families, and an enthusiasm for relocating entire civilizations. The Visigoths were first. They'd already visited once before, that unfortunate trip in 410 AD when they politely sacked Rome. But by the 420s, they were less raiders and more tenants. The empire, exhausted and short on armies, decided to hire them instead. They became federates, allied warriors paid to defend the borders. In theory, they were under Roman command. In practice, they were under new management. Rome had once prided itself on conquering others. Now it survived by signing peace treaties that read suspiciously like leases. The Visigoths got land in Gaul, modern France, built homes, planted crops, and settled in. They even developed their own kingdom, half Roman, half Gothic, all inevitable. But the Goths weren't the only ones who liked the scenery. The Vandals, a restless tribe from Central Europe, were tired of wandering. After years of crossing rivers, mountains, and various empires' patience, they reached Spain, and then, like every tired tourist before and after, they looked south and thought, Africa sounds nice. In 429 AD, they crossed the Mediterranean into Roman North Africa, the empire's breadbasket, the source of the grain that fed its cities. Within 10 years, they'd taken it all. Under their leader Genseric, the Vandals built ships, captured Carthage, and suddenly controlled the sea Rome once called its own. They became pirates, raiding Italy's coasts and disrupting trade. Rome, once the ruler of waves, now nervously checked the horizon. When ambassadors demanded the Vandals return Carthage, Genseric reportedly smiled and said, "We're just making ourselves comfortable." And they did, for nearly a century. The empire tried diplomacy, bribes, and several strongly worded letters. None worked. In 455 AD, the Vandals decided to visit Rome itself. Their ships appeared on the coast, sails white against the blue Mediterranean, a floating reminder that the Eternal City no longer controlled its own fate. The emperor at the time, Petronius Maximus, panicked. He tried to flee, but was caught by an angry crowd and killed, which, in fairness, had become a fairly traditional Roman exit strategy by then. 2 days later, the Vandals entered Rome. Unlike the Visigoths, they didn't bother with polite looting. They stripped the palaces, emptied the temples, and hauled away everything that glittered. Gold, jewels, furniture, even bronze statues, all packed onto ships and sent back to Carthage. They even took the empress and her daughters as guests, or hostages depending on one's optimism. For 2 full weeks, Rome was silent except for the sound of splintering wood and creaking ropes. When the Vandals finally sailed away, the city was still standing, but hollow, a marble shell echoing with ghosts and gulls. Modern historians argue that the Vandals weren't especially cruel, at least not by 5th century standards. They didn't burn the city. They didn't kill indiscriminately. They just took everything. But perception matters more than accuracy. To the Romans, the word vandal came to mean something much worse than theft. It meant violation, desecration, the undoing of civilization itself. Even today, when someone spray paints a wall or breaks a window, we still call it vandalism. That's their legacy, not empire, not conquest. Just the sound of something once perfect being quietly ruined. Meanwhile, the Eastern Empire in Constantinople watched all this from a safe distance. They offered moral support, possibly a fruit basket, but little else. The West was too weak to defend itself, too proud to admit it, and too broke to fix either problem. In the ruins of its provinces, new kingdoms sprouted like weeds: Gothic, Frankish, Vandal, Burgundian. Each one spoke a little Latin, worshipped a little Roman style, but ruled themselves. The empire was dissolving, not shattered, just melting. And yet, Rome's name still carried power. Every new king wanted to be Roman. They adopted its laws, copied its titles, and built their thrones from the splinters of its marble. Even the Vandals minted coins with imperial designs. You can almost hear the empire's ghost sighing, "Steal my gold, fine, but at least respect the branding." By the late 400s, the Western Empire was less an empire and more a memory with good stationery. Its emperors ruled mostly on paper. Its armies belonged to its enemies. Its gods had left. Its gold had vanished. And its people, tired, poor, nostalgic, clung to whatever version of Rome they could still imagine. Still, there was a strange peace in the aftermath. The barbarians had not destroyed the world. They had simply inherited its ruins. The empire was gone, but its roads remained. Its laws endured. Its language lingered on the tongues of the conquerors. Civilization didn't end. It just changed hands. So as you fall deeper into sleep, picture those slow-sailing ships on the Mediterranean. Their sails glowing orange in the dying light, hulls heavy with treasure, the sea calm as glass. Behind them, the city of Rome fades into twilight, its marble reflecting the last rays of the sun. The Vandals are gone. The empire is gone. But the water still whispers softly against the shore, carrying echoes of everything that once was and everything that will be again. While the Western Roman Empire was busy falling down a flight of marble stairs in slow motion, the Eastern Empire was sitting at its desk, sipping wine and pretending not to notice. Officially, they were still one empire, like divorced parents who keep sending each other birthday cards for the kids' sake. But by the 5th century, everyone knew the truth. The East had moved on, and it was thriving. Centered in Constantinople, the city built by Constantine, named by Constantine, and enthusiastically decorated by Constantine, the Eastern Roman Empire had everything the West didn't: gold, trade routes, fewer barbarians camping in the backyard, and a functioning postal system. It even had a new name whispered softly at first: Byzantium. Though its rulers still called themselves Romans, they knew they were different now, a little more Greek, a little more Christian, and a lot more smug. Where Rome had crumbled under the weight of tradition, Constantinople had adapted. Its walls were newer, its churches taller, its senators still alive. And in 476 AD, when the last Western Roman emperor was quietly escorted out of his office without so much as a parade or a meaningful meme, the East barely blinked. They sent a nice letter, said something like, "Sorry to hear about the empire. If you need anything, we'll be over here not being sacked." And then they changed. Absolutely nothing. Because from their perspective, they were the real Roman Empire now. They always had been. The man in charge of Byzantium at this time was Zeno, a tired, anxious emperor with more problems than sleep. When the Western court fell, he didn't panic. He simply folded the news into his paperwork pile and moved on. The Western Empire, he said, was no longer necessary. Rome had served its purpose. Everything important, the government, the gold, the gossip, now flowed through Constantinople. If civilization had to continue, it would do so with mosaics, candles, and a suspicious amount of theology. Still, Byzantium didn't ignore the West. It just curated it. Like a nostalgic collector, it picked the pieces it liked. Roman law, Roman architecture, Roman fashion, tunics were timeless, and politely left the rest in the basement. They rebuilt cities, restored statues, and wrote long essays about how superior they were to everyone else. But what they really wanted was control, not just of their half, but of everything. So, when an opportunity arrived in the 6th century, Byzantium decided it was time for a comeback. Enter Justinian I, emperor, law nerd, and enthusiastic renovationist. He didn't just want to rule Byzantium. He wanted to restore the Roman Empire to its full former glory, which is exactly the kind of ambition that keeps generals awake at night. He began a campaign to retake the West. In North Africa, he sent an army to reclaim land from the Vandals. It worked. The Vandals, probably distracted by all their looted furniture, fell quickly. Then he set his sights on Italy, launching a long, expensive, and deeply dramatic war to reclaim the heart of the old empire. It took nearly 20 years. Rome was fought over, burned, rebuilt, and fought over again, like a very grand couch in the world's messiest custody battle. In the end, Justinian got most of what he wanted. The empire was technically reunified, but it was also exhausted, bankrupt, and missing several roofs. Still, the victories were enough to make Byzantium feel powerful. For a brief, shining moment, it looked like the Roman Empire had returned. Coins were minted, triumphs held, poems written. But even as the banners flew, something had changed. The world had moved on, from senators and Caesars to kings and castles, bishops and barbarians. The West was no longer Roman, it was post-Roman. And Byzantium, despite its best efforts, was beginning to feel like a beautifully lit museum with no visitors. But what a museum it was. The Hagia Sophia, Justinian's crowning glory, rose like a dream above the city. Its domes glowed with gold. Its walls shimmered with mosaics of saints and angels. It was a cathedral, a statement, and an argument all at once. We are still Rome. We are still eternal. And for many centuries to come, they were. Byzantium would outlast the West by a full 1,000 years. It would see new empires rise, new religions spread, new enemies gather at its gates. It would face crusaders, Ottomans, earthquakes, and emperors with truly awful beards. But it held on, not just with armies and walls, but with memory, because memory was the real capital of Rome. And Constantinople remembered everything. Even as Western Europe stumbled through the fog of the Dark Ages, Byzantium copied books, debated philosophy, argued over theology, and kept the lights on. Literally, they had candles, lots of candles. They preserved Roman law, Roman history, Roman sass. They translated Greek texts into Latin, then back again just for fun. And though they rarely said it aloud, they never stopped believing, we are Rome. So as you drift into dreams tonight, picture that ancient city by the sea, the lanterns glowing in tiled courtyards, the sea breeze stirring silk curtains, the quiet hum of scribes copying ancient scrolls, by candlelight, by habit, by love. Rome hadn't died, it had changed address, and Byzantium, patient, golden, and mildly passive-aggressive, had inherited the keys. If the fall of Rome had a soundtrack, it wouldn't be war drums or trumpet fanfare. It would be the sound of wind moving through empty streets. Not a crash, not a scream, just a long, low sigh. Because in the end, Rome didn't fall, it faded. By the late 400s, the Western Empire was no longer a government. It was a memory on parchment, signed by emperors no one had seen in years, sealed with wax that had long since dried and cracked. The Senate still met. Technically, the laws were still written. Occasionally, coins still bore the names of men no one recognized. Faces carved into fading silver, exchanged at markets that no longer trusted what they were worth. Even the imperial title had become something of a costume. Handed out, taken back, handed out again, until finally, nobody wanted it. In 476 AD, a man named Romulus Augustulus, a teenage puppet with an unfortunate name, was the last to wear the crown. He wasn't assassinated. He wasn't overthrown in a blaze of glory. He was simply let go. A general named Odoacer politely told him to step down. Romulus agreed, probably with the quiet enthusiasm of someone being released from a very strange internship. And just like that, the Western Roman Empire ended, not with fire, but with a letter of resignation. The people of Italy didn't revolt. There were no headlines, no hashtags, because by then, the empire had already stopped feeling like an empire. It was a faded painting on a crumbling wall, beautiful, familiar, and slowly being forgotten. But the marble remained. Temples stood empty, their roofs slowly caving in, their steps worn smooth by centuries of sandals. Columns reached towards skies that no longer recognized them. Fountains trickled, then dried. Statues lost noses, then arms, then names. And in the Forum, the heart of Roman public life, weeds pushed through the cracks. Yet people still lived there, still walked those streets, still slept in the shadows of things once great. Rome did not become a ruin. Rome was a ruin in slow motion. The grandeur faded gradually, the way sunlight fades from a stone courtyard in the evening. Soft, reluctant, beautiful. Some parts of the city were scavenged, the Colosseum stripped for its iron clamps, temples turned into barns, theatres converted into workshops. Old marble was broken and reused in new buildings. Even the roads were dug up to find stones for paving someone's villa. Rome, that eternal monument to ambition, had become the world's most expensive quarry. And yet, in the silence of abandoned basilicas, you could still hear the echo of speeches. In the empty baths, the ghosts of laughter still lingered in the steam. In the moonlit streets, broken statues watched over crumbling walls with the same blank stares they'd always had. The soul of Rome hadn't vanished. It had settled, like dust, like memory, like time. Visitors came, centuries later, walking among the ruins with wide eyes. They spoke in French, in German, in English. They pointed at fallen arches and said, "This was Rome." And they were right, but also not quite, because Rome wasn't just stones and names. It was a rhythm, a pulse, a dream of order in a chaotic world. And dreams don't end. They fade, then return. In art, in language, in laws, in whispers passed down through generations, too quiet to forget. Even the church, that rising power of the medieval world, built its cathedrals atop Roman foundations. Basilicas grew from temples. Pilgrims followed roads that legions once marched. Priests said prayers in Latin, the same language senators had once used to declare war and raise taxes. Rome lived on, but in disguise. No longer an empire, now an ancestor. And what of the people? The ordinary Romans, bakers, farmers, stonemasons, scribes. They didn't see an empire fall. They saw roofs collapse, food grow scarce, guards stop showing up. They saw old gods vanish and new ones arrive. They saw marble turn into firewood, but they also saw the sunrise, the harvest, the next generation. Empires end, but people keep going. So as the curtain closes on this long, quiet decline, picture Rome at dusk, the last rays of sunlight stretching across broken rooftops, the Tiber flowing calmly, carrying dust, leaves, and pieces of forgotten statues. A dog sleeping beside a fountain. A child chasing a cart through the forum, unaware that history lies beneath her feet. The empire is gone, but the city still dreams. The marble dreams slowly, softly, endlessly, because nothing truly eternal dies. It simply waits, beneath the dust, behind the ivy, under the moon, for someone to remember it again. Rome had fallen, not with a bang, but with a faint creak of a wooden door closing forever. And yet, no one quite left. You might expect that when an empire collapses, people pack their bags, change their flags, and move on. But the strange thing about Rome was how long it lingered. Not just in bricks and roads, but in minds. For centuries after its so-called fall, people still called themselves Romans, even if they had never seen the city, even if they lived in places Rome had never touched, even if the last emperor had been gone for 100 years. It was like a ghost story whispered by candlelight. There had once been a great city, they said, with marble streets, golden fountains, and laws that kept the world in balance. There had been men in togas who knew how to speak so beautifully they could convince you to pay taxes and thank them for it. There had been temples that brushed the clouds, armies that marched like thunder, and roads that went forever in every direction. Even when those things no longer existed, people remembered. And in their remembering, they built new things. In Northern Europe, Germanic kings wore Roman-style robes. In Spain, Visigothic laws were written in Latin. In Britain, long after the legions left, villagers still repaired Roman roads with Roman stones. The old world had ended, but no one told the world it had to stop dreaming. Medieval pilgrims walked through ruined cities, staring up at broken aqueducts and calling them miracles. To them, the Colosseum was not a sports arena. It was the work of giants. The statues were not just old men in stone. They were saints, or prophets, or perhaps forgotten gods. Every crack in the marble whispered a story. Every weed growing through the paving stones had seen an empire die. And in the silence, imagination did what history could not. It filled in the gaps. It rewrote the chapters. It made Rome not just a place that was, but a place that should be again. Even the church, the rising power of the post-Roman world, couldn't help but inherit a little of Rome's ghost. The Pope became a figure not just of faith, but of imperial authority. The churches looked suspiciously like old basilicas, and Latin, that fading musical language, became the voice of God. Rome had fallen, but Rome had also become heaven adjacent, which, by historical standards, is a pretty good promotion. And so, the Middle Ages became haunted, not by vampires or banshees, but by the idea of Rome. Knights marched in formation, hoping to look Roman. Kings carved eagles into their banners. Scholars copied ancient texts, squinting at faded ink under flickering candlelight. No one knew exactly what the old empire had looked like, but everyone knew it had been better, cleaner, wiser, more organized. Rome became a mirror that made everything else feel smaller. Even when the Renaissance arrived, with its artists, its thinkers, its beards, what did they do first? They started digging up statues, studying old coins, reading old Roman books and saying, this is how it should be. Rome had been dead for 1,000 years, and yet somehow it still got more press than most living governments. That's what made it so strange. Rome didn't haunt places. It haunted time. It was always just out of reach, not in the past, but in the corner of the eye. The thing every empire afterward reached for. Napoleon wanted to be Caesar. So did Mussolini. So did a few overconfident middle managers. Even America, when it started designing its capital city, made sure to add domes, columns, Latin mottos, and just the right amount of ego. Because Rome, in the end, had done the one thing every empire wants to do. It had convinced the world it mattered, even after it stopped functioning. That's the power of a good ghost story. And so, even now, in our age of satellites and smartphones and 3 a.m. pasta deliveries, Rome is still here, in our languages, in our laws, in the way we build cities, in the stories we tell about what greatness is supposed to look like. If you walk through Rome today, and you should, if you ever get the chance, you'll see it all at once, the past, the future, and the very confused tourists in between. You'll hear scooters buzzing past 2,000-year-old walls. You'll see pigeons sitting on the heads of forgotten emperors. You'll smell espresso and ghost stories rising in the morning light. The empire may have ended, but the city never stopped dreaming. So tonight, let it dream again. Let the ghosts walk softly through the ruins, touching the stones, remembering old poems. Let them whisper to the wind, "We were here." And let that whisper linger, like a breath, like a myth, like Rome itself. If you've ever left milk out overnight, you already understand how Rome fell. Not with a dramatic smash, but with a slow, quiet curdling. Empires, like leftovers, don't usually go bad from one problem. It's the combination that gets you. A little mold, a little warmth, some neglect, and a lot of people insisting it still smells fine. Rome didn't have one fatal flaw. It had about 10,000. Let's start with the economy. At its height, Rome had gold pouring in from all directions, taxes, tribute, and the occasional friendly looting. But eventually, the flow slowed, and the spending didn't. The emperors kept hiring more soldiers, building more palaces, throwing more festivals. To pay for it all, they debased the currency, literally mixing cheaper metals into silver coins and hoping no one noticed. People noticed, especially the bakers. Bread prices rose, so did complaints, and eventually people started trading in chickens again. Then there was the bureaucracy. Rome loved paperwork like poets love metaphors, passionately, and to its own detriment. Every aspect of life needed a permit. Every transaction required 3 witnesses, a wax seal, and a minor deity's blessing. Soon, entire offices existed to explain what other offices did. If you wanted to build a wall, you had to apply for permission to request authorization to consider a wall. It was efficiency by way of exhaustion. And don't forget the leadership. Over a few centuries, Rome went through emperors the way modern people go through streaming shows. Curious at first, emotionally invested briefly, and then suddenly bored. There were good emperors, yes, but also paranoid ones, delusional ones, child emperors, puppet emperors. One emperor who thought he was Hercules and challenged senators to wrestling matches. Spoiler, the senators lost. Then there were the generals. They were supposed to serve the empire. Instead, many decided to become the empire. They led armies. They made promises. They marched into Rome and said, "Surprise, I'm emperor now." The guards would shrug. The Senate would pretend it was part of the plan, and someone would start minting new coins. Rinse, repeat, civil war. Meanwhile, out on the borders, things were getting crunchy. Rome had always pushed outward, conquer, fortify, repeat. But after a few centuries, those fortresses got expensive, and those barbarian tribes just kept multiplying. Eventually, Rome tried a new strategy. Hire the barbarians, pay them to protect the borders. And they did, until they stopped. Then they became the new problem. Rome had to pay someone else to fight. Eventually, the empire was hiring barbarians to protect itself from other barbarians it had hired last week. Religion didn't help either. At first, Rome had hundreds of gods and thousands of shrines. Everyone got along, mostly. Then came Christianity, slow at first, then rapidly dominant. The empire went from tolerating all faiths to arguing about which bishop was technically more correct than the other bishops. Emperors were baptized, then excommunicated, then declared heretics, then declared saints, sometimes in that order. By the end, the church was the only part of the empire that still sent letters on time. Culturally, Rome suffered from its own success. Once known for hard work and public virtue, it gradually shifted into a society of elites in villas, farmers in debt, and citizens nostalgic for the good old days that probably weren't that good. The gladiator games got bloodier, the baths got fancier, the senators got lazier, and whenever things got tough, everyone blamed either the Christians, the pagans, the tax collectors, or the weather. Infrastructure collapsed in slow motion. Aqueducts broke. Roads wore down. Temples became barns. In the countryside, people stopped going to cities. In the cities, people stopped expecting anything to be repaired. It's hard to maintain an empire when no one can fix a roof. Then there was the weather. Yes, even the climate took a turn. Around the 3rd century, a mini ice age swept across Europe. Harvests failed, plague spread, people moved, and the economy, already wobbling, lost its last bit of traction. If empires had thermostats, someone had definitely nudged Rome's down a few degrees. So there it was, not one problem, but 10,000. Like a grand marble statue, slowly cracking in the rain. Like a 1,000-year-old house, sagging beam by beam, while everyone inside insists it's still perfectly livable. But the most Roman thing of all, they kept trying. Even in the final years, with no gold, no troops, no functioning government, someone still wrote a speech about how the empire was stronger than ever. Someone still marched in a triumph. Someone still carved a new statue, though probably with cheaper marble. They didn't know it was the end. They just thought it was a particularly bad decade. Maybe 2. So as you drift off tonight, picture the empire as it truly was at the end. Still shining in places, still proud, still quoting Cicero, but also duct taped together, held upright by inertia and hope. A 1,000-year machine running on fumes and ceremony, and in the distance, the sound of boots. New rulers, new ideas, new empires on the rise. Rome had been great. It had also been a mess. And now, it would become a story, told by candlelight, in dreams, in whispers, in 10,000 easy steps. While generals swung swords and emperors reshuffled the furniture, a quieter group watched Rome crumble from the shadows. They didn't command legions. They didn't build aqueducts. They sat up at night with oil lamps and questions, big ones, like, what does it mean to be good? Why do empires die? And is the universe mad at us or just misunderstood? These were the philosophers, and they did what philosophers always do during times of collapse. They wrote, a lot, usually while wrapped in blankets and muttering. In the final centuries of Rome, these thinkers became something like therapists for a civilization on the brink. Not that anyone listened, of course, but they wrote anyway, because someone had to. One of the first, and loudest, was Augustine of Hippo, a bishop, a former party boy, and possibly the most influential overthinker in Western history. When Rome was sacked in 410 AD, people panicked. They assumed the end of the world was literally happening. The eternal city had fallen, so obviously, so would everything else. Sun, moon, morals, the whole package. But Augustine, sitting in North Africa, squinted at the ruins and said, "Maybe. Rome was never the point." He wrote a massive book called The City of God. Over 1 million words of theology, philosophy, and soft-shaded commentary on empire. His basic idea: there are two cities, the city of man, which builds, conquers, brags, then collapses, and the city of God, invisible, spiritual, and really good at delayed gratification. So if Rome fell, that wasn't the end. It was just the end of the wrong city. People found comfort in that. Not enough to fix the aqueducts, but enough to keep going. Because if empires could fall, but meaning still remained, then maybe life was still worth living, even without public baths. Later came Boethius. He had the kind of resume that screams future trivia. Question: Roman senator, philosopher, Christian, accused of treason, imprisoned by a king, and eventually executed. But before that final act, he did something remarkable. He wrote one last book from a jail cell, waiting to die. It was called The Consolation of Philosophy, because naturally, when facing a death sentence, Boethius decided to have a long conversation with an imaginary woman named Lady Philosophy. She shows up in his cell, gently tells him to stop crying, and reminds him that fortune is basically a spin wheel with bad manners. She says, "Things change, empires fall. Happiness isn't about power or wealth. It's about virtue, and not yelling at clouds." Paraphrased, but spiritually accurate. Boethius's book became a bestseller for 1,000 years, read by monks, kings, scholars, and anyone who'd ever felt like life wasn't fair, which in post-Roman Europe was everyone. These philosophers didn't rebuild the empire, but they did something subtler. They gave meaning to its fall. They told people, "You're not crazy. The world is falling apart. But here's how to stay sane while it happens." In doing so, they bridged the gap between the Roman mind and the medieval one. They turned marble thoughts into monastic ones. They lit small candles of logic and hope, flickering in the dark corridors of abbeys where the wind still whispered Latin, and they weren't alone. Throughout the collapsing empire, other thinkers wrestled with the same questions. Was the universe still orderly? Was virtue possible in chaos? Was history a spiral or a straight line? Why do we keep building empires that forget to last? No one had answers, but they kept asking. That was Rome's final gift. A civilization so obsessed with thinking, it accidentally invented the survival of thought itself. Because long after the marble crumbled, after the soldiers disbanded, after the scrolls were hidden in monasteries guarded by sheepdogs with anxiety, the questions remained, written in ink, stored in silence, passed down by candlelight, a quiet rebellion against despair. If you've ever stayed up too late wondering what it all means, you're part of that tradition. If you've ever read an old book and felt the writer looking back through time, you're sharing a conversation that began in the ruins. And if you've ever whispered into the dark, "Wasn't there once something greater?" then you too are dreaming like a Roman. So tonight, as the wind presses against the window and the room grows still, think of Augustine writing through grief, Boethius writing through fear, and all the others too tired to save the empire, but too stubborn to stop thinking. Let their words be your blanket. Let their questions keep you company. Let their stories, quiet, slow, and burning like embers, remind you that even in collapse, there is still something worth understanding. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire was basically running on vibes. The aqueducts were leaky, the soldiers were unpaid. The Senate still met, mostly out of habit, but technically there was still an emperor, And his name, because history has a sense of humor, was Romulus Augustulus. Romulus, as in the mythical founder of Rome. Augustulus, as in Little Augustus. It was like naming the last CEO of a collapsing company Founder McStartup Jr., a title that screamed legacy, whispered through a paper bag. Romulus wasn't chosen for his strength or statesmanship. He was placed on the throne by his father, a general named Orestes, who probably looked around and thought, "Hey, let's try my kid." Romulus was about 14. He had no power, no plan, and no say in what was about to happen next. He wore the purple robes. He signed a few documents. He probably waved from balconies while secretly wondering if anyone still knew how to cook a proper Roman dinner. He ruled for 10 months, which, in late Roman standards, was actually not bad. But trouble, as always, was already knocking, literally. A group of soldiers, mostly Germanic mercenaries, came to Orestes and said, "Hey, remember when you promised us land if we fought for you?" And Orestes, in classic Roman fashion, said, "Oh, did I say that out loud?" The soldiers, unimpressed, turned to one of their own, a leader named Odoacer, a man with a sword, a following, and a distinct lack of patience. Odoacer did what ambitious men always do at the end of empires. He marched into Italy. Orestes tried to stop him. Orestes failed, and before long, Odoacer stood at the gates of Ravenna, Rome's sleepy backup capital, chosen mainly for its marshes and general dampness. Inside, the teenage emperor waited, not with armies, not with hope, but probably with a stomachache. The moment of transition, the one historians call the fall of Rome, was not a battle. It wasn't even a negotiation. Odoacer simply told Romulus to step down, and Romulus, being 14, realistic, and mildly terrified, said, "Yeah, okay." No throne room duel, no tearful farewell, just a very awkward handoff of a very symbolic job. But here's the twist. Odoacer didn't kill him. He didn't exile him. He didn't parade him through the streets. He gave him a pension, a villa, some land, and the one thing Rome rarely gave anyone, a quiet retirement. Romulus Augustulus disappeared from history, gently, like a candle burning down to the last flicker, then going still. Some say he lived into old age. Others think he became a monk. No one really knows. But his exit was so gentle, so politely handled, that the greatest empire in Western history technically ended with a severance package. And that's what makes it so surreal. The Roman Empire, with its legions, its laurels, its obsession with grandeur, ended with a shrug. There was no et tu, brute, no last stand, no famous final speech, just a teenager handing back the crown and probably muttering, "Good luck with all that." Odoacer, for his part, didn't call himself emperor. He called himself King of Italy, a new title for a new world. He sent the imperial regalia, the crown, the purple robes, the golden eagle, to Constantinople, along with a polite note that basically said, "Thanks, but we're done here." The Eastern Roman Emperor, sitting safe in Byzantium, nodded, filed the paperwork, and quietly crossed Western Empire off the guest list. And so, the age of emperors in the West ended, not with fire, but with a signature, not with a cry, but with silence. The world turned, the barbarians became kings, the senators went home, and Rome, the real beating heart of it, kept sleeping. In many ways, Romulus was the perfect last emperor. Young, powerless, symbolic, forgotten. He carried the weight of 1,000 years, and then gently put it down. No rebellion, no betrayal. Just the end of a very long sentence, punctuated with a quiet exhale. So tonight, as you lie in bed, imagine the last emperor of Rome, not on a battlefield, but in a quiet villa, watching the sun set over a garden that no longer belongs to an empire. No servants rushing, no guards at the gate. Just one boy, one ghost of a crown, and the soft rustle of history folding itself away. Not with shame, not with pride, just with peace. So Rome fell. The emperors were gone. The legions disbanded, the banners furled. And yet, Rome didn't disappear. It kept sitting there quietly, like a very old cat no one wanted to move. The year is now something like 480 AD. There's no Western Roman Empire anymore. Just Italy, ruled by Odoacer, a barbarian-turned-king who now had to figure out things like tax codes and grain shipments. He wasn't Roman, but he also wasn't not Roman. Because here's the funny thing about barbarians. Once they conquered Rome, they immediately started acting Roman. The temples were still there, the aqueducts mostly. The Senate, well, technically, it still met, though mostly to sigh. And the people? They just continued. The baker still baked. The potter still spun his wheel. The scribe still copied half-legible scrolls and muttered about ink shortages. To them, life didn't feel like a collapse. It felt like Monday. The old systems were crumbling, yes, but they didn't vanish overnight. Rome after Rome was like a building slowly being renovated by people who had lost the blueprints and were now just guessing based on vibes. In the countryside, landlords still collected rent. Taxes still existed, though they were more like friendly suggestions. And in the cities, the ruins weren't seen as ruins. They were normal. Children played tag around fallen columns. Merchants set up stalls in cracked forums. A goat might wander through what used to be the Temple of Saturn. It was all very casual. The kings who ruled the post-Roman world weren't trying to erase Rome. They were trying to inherit it. Odoacer didn't melt the statues. He restored them. He paid Roman administrators to keep doing what they'd always done. Misplaced documents and overcomplicate everything. The new rulers wrote laws, collected bribes, and sent polite letters to Constantinople, pretending they were still part of a big imperial family, because no one wanted to admit that Rome was truly gone, not even its conquerors. And so, the West became a mosaic, fragments of empire, held together by habit, nostalgia, and stubborn continuity. The Visigoths ruled Spain, but wrote their laws in Latin. The Franks ruled Gaul, but wore Roman cloaks and quoted Roman philosophers, mostly incorrectly. The Vandals ruled North Africa, but minted coins that looked like they came straight from Augustus's wallet. Everyone still called themselves Romans, even if they didn't quite know what that meant anymore. Meanwhile, the city of Rome itself, the once great capital of the world, became a kind of holy ghost. No emperor lived there. No armies marched through its gates. Its population shrank. Its forums filled with grass. Its mighty buildings began to sag like tired shoulders. But people still came. Pilgrims, monks, wandering nobles hoping to feel something ancient in the air. And they did, because Rome, even after it fell, still felt like Rome. The church, rising steadily in power, moved in to fill the vacuum. The Pope became more than a priest. He became a kind of spiritual emperor. He lived in Rome, spoke Latin, and claimed to be the heir of St. Peter, which, in Roman branding terms, was basically the gold standard. The old imperial buildings became churches. The old holidays became saints' days. And the new world rose like ivy on the bones of the old. But it was a strange kind of rebirth. The people living in Rome after Rome weren't building a future. They were living inside a memory, a broken city full of stories, a crumbling masterpiece no one dared paint over. They didn't know how to move forward, so they kept circling the past, quoting laws no one enforced, repairing monuments no one used, retelling myths everyone half believed. Rome had fallen, but it was still there, breathing, barely, but enough. And that's what makes this moment so quiet and so powerful. Because what came after Rome wasn't dark or light, it was grey, a world of half-remembered greatness, of former emperors turned legends, of roads that led nowhere but were still walked, a world where the dream of Rome echoed louder than the reality ever had. Tonight, as you rest beneath modern ceilings, in a world with lights and satellites and indoor plumbing, know that you are living on the other side of that echo. The empire is gone, but the patterns it left behind, the way cities are shaped, the way laws are written, the way power imagines itself, those still walk among us, quietly, unseen, but real, like Rome itself after Rome. Conquering Rome was the easy part. Running it, that was more complicated. The barbarians, those famously unshaven, fur-cloaked, sword-happy newcomers, had spent centuries trying to get into the empire. And then, somehow, they did. And once inside, they looked around and thought, wait, who's in charge of plumbing? It turns out, when you conquer a superpower, you inherit its to-do list. And Rome's list was long. Feed the cities, repair the roads, pay the soldiers, collect taxes, host festivals, keep the bridges from collapsing, and ideally avoid being murdered by disgruntled senators, starving mobs, or relatives with ambition issues. This wasn't a pillage and go situation anymore. This was property management, and no one had brought a clipboard. The new rulers had impressive names: Theodoric the Great, Gundobad, Clovis. Names that sound like they should be swinging axes, not reviewing grain inventories. But swing axes they did, and then they picked up pens, or at least dictated things to people who knew how pens worked, because they had to govern now, which meant figuring out how to keep the Roman world running without understanding most of it. Take Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths. He ruled Italy after Odoacer, the man who ended the Western Empire. Theodoric didn't just want to survive. He wanted to impress. He dressed in Roman robes. He held Roman-style courts. He respected the Senate, restored the aqueducts, and kept the Roman bureaucrats right where he found them, underpaid and confused. He even built palaces in Ravenna that looked straight out of Caesar's Pinterest board. Marble mosaics, vaulted ceilings, columns, the whole aesthetic. To the average citizen, it was business as usual. The emperor had a beard now, sure, but the roads still worked mostly. In Gaul, the Franks under Clovis pulled a similar move. They converted to Christianity, the Roman kind, not the barbarian variation, just to win points with the bishops. Clovis also kept Roman laws, Roman administrators, and Roman coins, though he did add his own flair, a habit of solving disputes by personally stabbing people at feasts, which admittedly wasn't unheard of in Rome either. Even the Vandals in North Africa, pirates, pillagers, coastal nuisances, had to settle down. After they took Carthage, they started maintaining trade routes, built shipyards, collected taxes, because even if you arrive with swords, you stay with spreadsheets. It wasn't easy. The barbarian kings ruled people who didn't speak their language. Their subjects still prayed in Latin, read Virgil, and held awkward nostalgia for emperors who'd long since gone to history's recycling bin. But slowly, things adjusted. Laws were rewritten. Land was redistributed. The sword blended with the scroll. These kings were no longer invaders. They were landlords, accidental mayors of ancient cities they barely understood. They weren't rebuilding Rome, but they were renting it out. And yet, beneath all the renovations and alliances, something had shifted. Rome had been a system, a self-renewing machine of politics, infrastructure, and identity. Now, it was a stage set, passed from one king to another. A beautiful, fragile script that everyone was trying to read, often upside down. But here's the thing. They didn't destroy it. They preserved it, imperfectly, clumsily, often by accident. They wore the titles. They walked the roads. They kept the dream alive, even if they forgot some lines. Because it turns out, once you inherit a world, you don't get to just burn it down. You have to feed it, water it, repair its leaking roofs, and eventually, you learn to care for it. Historians used to call this the Dark Ages, but that's not quite right. It was more of a dimly lit hallway, full of flickering lanterns and people bumping into Roman furniture they weren't sure how to use. Not dark, just transitioning, like a city under new management, where the power still works. But no one knows how to operate the heating system. So tonight, picture those new kings, fur cloaks draped over Roman chairs, scrolls in one hand, sword in the other, asking their advisors things like, do we feed the poor before or after the census? What's a proconsul? Why is the plumbing angry again? And somewhere in the distance, a Roman farmer tills his field like he always has, unimpressed by whoever's in charge this week. Because for most people, the fall of an empire is less about collapse and more about who's knocking on the door for rent. Once upon a time, Rome was marble, smooth, white, gleaming. Temples soared, arches stood proud, fountains gushed with confidence. It was a city of orders, architectural, political, philosophical, the center of the world wrapped in columns. And then, one day, it wasn't. Because when the emperors left and the army stopped marching and the administrators stopped administering, Rome found itself between eras, too grand to be forgotten, too broken to be useful. So what do you do with a city like that? Simple. You remodel it, very slowly, with whatever's lying around. The Rome of the Middle Ages didn't tear down the old world. It just reused it. Marble was expensive. So was time. So when a church needed new floors, they pried up pieces of the forum. When someone needed a doorway, they borrowed a fallen column. Even the Colosseum, once filled with lions, gladiators, and the occasional trumpet solo, became a quarry. Its iron clamps were hammered out. Its marble blocks were carted off. Some parts became churches. Other parts became someone's extremely fancy chicken coop. Rome was being recycled. Not out of disrespect, but out of practicality. The city didn't shrink all at once. But over the centuries, its population dropped. Once home to over 1 million people, it dwindled to just a few thousand. Hills that had once held palaces now held sheep. The grand theatres echoed only with the wind. And the streets, some still bore their Latin names. Others had names like Goat Alley and Where the Water Broke. The empire was gone, but people still had babies, still spilled things, still got lost. History had moved out, but life stayed. The medieval Romans didn't see ruins, they saw resources. Need a wall? There's a temple for that. Need a grave slab? Find a nice piece of carved marble and flip it over. Need a saint to pray to? Rename a statue. The statue of Minerva, goddess of wisdom, becomes a Christian martyr. The old public bathhouse, now it's a monastery. The Pantheon, still standing, just with a cross on top and fewer naked statues. This was Rome's great talent, survival by repurposing. The bones of empire became the bricks of the Middle Ages. The temples of gods became homes for saints. The road still led to Rome, but fewer people were in a hurry to get there. And those who did, mostly monks, pilgrims, dusty scholars clutching scrolls and squinting at inscriptions no one had cleaned in 100 years. Even the city's timekeeping changed. Once, everything had revolved around the emperor's calendar. Now it followed the church's rhythms, feast days, saint days, fasting days, and that one confusing week when no one knew what year it was anymore. Rome had shifted from empire to parish, from thunder to whisper, but not everything was sacred. Some of it was just odd. There was a medieval pope who tried to put another dead pope on trial. He dressed the corpse up, propped it in a chair, and assigned it a lawyer. It went about as well as you'd imagine. There were cows grazing next to the Arch of Titus. There were noble families using ancient mausoleums as fortresses. And there were pigeons, so many pigeons, sitting on the heads of once mighty emperors, as if to say, yes, yes, eternal glory, but also breadcrumbs, please. Yet in all this mess, there was something beautiful, because Rome never tried to restore the past. It let time do its thing. It wore the centuries like layers, marble beneath brick, statue beneath soot, history beneath history. And if you knew where to look, you could still trace the outlines of greatness, hidden in alleys carved into walls, echoing through churches that used to be temples, that used to be marketplaces, that used to be dreams. Tourists today see ruins. Medieval Romans saw walls that didn't fall over. They didn't feel nostalgic. They felt resourceful. They were making do, living in a museum they didn't have to pay for. And slowly, without realizing it, they were building the foundation for the Renaissance. Because every reused brick, every copied manuscript, every church built over a basilica was a kind of bridge from ancient Rome to future Rome, from marble memory to something new, something still Roman, but now with saints, scaffolding, and the occasional goat. So as you drift into sleep, picture the Rome of the Middle Ages, quiet, dusty, half forgotten, but breathing. A shepherd guides his flock past the temple of Saturn. A child skips past broken columns. A monk sits in a crumbling tower, copying Virgil by candlelight. The city is no longer grand, but it's still here. And somewhere beneath the ivy, you can still hear the echo of empire. Soft, persistent, and very slightly off-key. For most people, the Roman Empire ended in 476 AD. You can draw a nice clean line, put it on a timeline, underline it in red, the end. But historians, oh no, they don't do clean. They do debates, seminars, footnotes so long they need their own zip code. To a historian, Rome didn't fall. It transitioned. It reconfigured. It underwent a period of structural ambiguity within late antique paradigms, which is a very academic way of saying nobody really knows, but everyone has an opinion. Some say it fell in 410 AD when the Visigoths sacked Rome, the first time the Eternal City had been invaded in 800 years. Others say 476 AD, when Romulus Augustulus handed over the crown and went off to enjoy early retirement. A few point to 554, when Emperor Justinian tried to stitch the empire back together like an ancient Frankenstein project, and briefly succeeded. Others argue for 1453, when Constantinople finally fell, and the Eastern Roman Empire, now called Byzantium, went quiet for good. And there are a handful of optimists who insist it never really fell at all. It just rebranded. It's all very confusing, but kind of perfect. Because if there's one thing Rome loved, it was debating things for far too long. Senators once spent days arguing about the best size for a public statue. Now, scholars spend decades arguing about when exactly the whole thing ended. It's a kind of tribute, really. Rome may be gone, but its habit of talking in circles lives on. There are entire books with titles like The Fall of Rome, Did It Even Happen? The Transformation of the Roman World, Crisis or Continuity, Rome, Decline, Decay, or just a really long nap. Some historians blame the barbarians. Others say it was economic collapse. Some point to lead poisoning. Others to climate change or plague, or poor leadership, or too much marble and not enough bread. A few even blame the Romans themselves for becoming soft, nostalgic, and obsessed with gladiator shows, which, depending on your definition, could describe almost any society. But here's the thing. When historians argue about when Rome fell, they're really arguing about what Rome was. Was it the emperors, the laws, the buildings, the language, the dream? If it was just about emperors, sure. Rome ended in 476. If it was about roads, coins, and calendars, then Rome is still with us. And if it was about the idea of a civilization that could last forever, well, that's the one that keeps whispering. There's a story about a monk in the 700s copying an old Roman text by hand. He doesn't understand all of it. Some of the names are strange. Some of the words don't mean anything anymore. But he keeps going, letter by letter, because something tells him it's important. That's how Rome lived. Not with armies, but with ink, copied across centuries by people who didn't always know why, only that it mattered. And that's the secret Rome knew better than anyone. Ideas travel. Ideas last. The empire may have collapsed, but the idea of Rome kept walking, through monasteries, manuscripts, libraries, and lectures, through art and architecture, and through 100 sleepy classrooms where students learn Latin and ask why. Even today, when historians gather at conferences, wearing tweed and arguing gently over cookies, someone inevitably says, well, technically, the fall of Rome is a bit of a misnomer. And everyone nods, because no one really wants the empire to be over, because there's something comforting in Rome. Not the power, not the empire, but the idea that things can be built to last, that law can outlive war, that stories can outlive cities, that even when everything else is crumbling, someone somewhere is still writing it down. So tonight, as you sink deeper into sleep, picture a library filled with candlelight, scrolls stacked to the ceiling, dust in the air, and in a corner, a historian, scribbling, erasing, starting over, trying to answer a question that has no answer. When did it end? And maybe that's the point. Rome didn't fall on a Tuesday. It didn't pack up and leave. It wandered slowly out of focus until all that remained was the sound of turning pages. Some empires collapse like a tower, loud, sudden, unforgettable. Rome fell more like a long, slow landslide, one pebble at a time. So slow, in fact, that people living in the middle of it didn't even know it was happening. They just thought the aqueduct needed repairs again. The truth is, Rome didn't fall once. It fell constantly, in whispers, in paperwork, in roofs that were never patched, in soldiers who never got paid, in farmers who stopped planting because the roads were too dangerous to reach the markets. It fell in every missing stone, every crumbling arch, every time someone said, "Remember when this used to work?" It wasn't a disaster. It was decay, the kind that comes not from enemies, but from forgetting to keep sweeping the floors, the kind of fall that leaves the doors open so the wind can wander in and start rearranging history. One emperor dies, another rises, A governor defects. A fort is abandoned. Each moment small, each moment manageable. But together, they become the sound of something quietly letting go. You might imagine that people mourned the empire, but most didn't, because most were too busy trying to find firewood. The bakers still baked, the smiths still hammered, the children still played in courtyards full of fallen statues. They weren't watching for the end of Rome. They were watching the sky for rain and hoping the price of grain would go down. Even centuries later, when scholars look back and try to mark the end, what they really found was a trail of endings, like old footsteps in the dust, leading in every direction and none. The empire fell every time a general declared himself emperor, every time a city wall cracked, every time a tax collector stopped showing up, and the villagers said, "Let's just run things ourselves." It fell in every prayer said in Latin, long after no one knew what the words meant. It fell in every stolen brick, every borrowed column, every empty bathhouse turned goat pen. And even after it officially ended, it kept falling. Because Rome had grown so large, so intricate, so intertwined with everything, that its collapse had aftershocks that echoed through time. Every medieval kingdom that rose in its place was built on the scaffolding of Rome. They borrowed its laws, its language, its architecture, its habit of assuming the world should be impressed with them. Rome had fallen, but its blueprint was still being photocopied. Even today, when we speak in courts, when we vote in assemblies, when we use calendars and concrete and central heating, somewhere beneath it all, Rome is still falling, softly, slowly, forever. Because when something lasts 1,000 years, it doesn't end with one event. It ends in layers, like a song that fades verse by verse, a dream that dims but keeps pulsing at the edge of sleep, a memory that blurs but never quite disappears. You can see it in the ruins, in the missing noses of statues, in the faded inscriptions that once declared divine victories, in the broken bridges that still span rivers, just enough to remind you something once crossed there. Rome doesn't haunt us because it ended. It haunts us because it never entirely did. And maybe that's why we still talk about it, still write about it, still visit its stones, run our hands across cold columns, and say, "This mattered." Because Rome is the empire that refused to vanish. It didn't vanish. It eroded. It dissolved. It slipped into other names. And now it lives quietly in courtrooms and currencies, in floor plans and philosophies, in dreams of empire that no one admits having. But everyone still builds around. So tonight, as you drift into stillness, imagine not the moment Rome fell, but the moment it fell just a little more. A tile coming loose, a gate left open, a law forgotten, a story retold just slightly wrong. That's how empires fade, not in thunder, but in repetition. And as the stars turn above the old city and the wind carries dust through the arches, you can almost hear it, the soft sound of something ancient still falling, a whisper, a crumble, a history that doesn't know it's ended. If you ever visit Rome, the real one, the quiet one beneath the noise, you'll find it everywhere, not just in museums, but in the gaps between things, in the cracks of marble stairs, in the fading grooves of letters carved 2,000 years ago, in a stone column holding up a modern cafe, in the dust that settles on everything, gently, like time saying, "I remember." Rome speaks, not with voices, but with shapes, arches, columns, domes, bricks stacked so precisely, it might as well have been whispered into place. You don't need to know Latin to hear it. You just have to walk slowly and listen. There's a strange silence in Roman ruins. Not empty, just deep. A kind of silence that holds stories. Like, this was once a temple. Here, a senator argued. There, a girl sold olives and tried not to get trampled. Right here, a soldier paused, looked at the sky, and thought about going home. They're still there, not the people, but the echoes. Memories carved into stone by weather, footsteps, and time. The Pantheon still stands, as if daring the sky to try anything. Its dome, still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, was poured by hand, without modern tools, by men who believed the gods lived in geometry. Walk beneath it and your footsteps slow. Not by choice, but because some spaces ask you to whisper. The Forum lies in pieces now, columns without roofs, temples without gods, streets without voices. But if you stand still long enough, you might hear the click of sandals, the rise and fall of oratory, the hum of gossip, the bark of market dogs, all gone, all still here. That's the trick of marble. It remembers, even when it breaks, even when it's covered in soot, or turned into a stairwell, or dropped into a river and pulled out 800 years later by a confused fisherman. It remembers, because Rome didn't just build things to last, it built them to mean something. And meaning, it turns out, has a long half-life. The statues are especially good at holding secrets. Their eyes are blank now, their noses chipped, their arms missing. But the posture still speaks. Pride, power, elegance, occasionally mild confusion. Each statue was once someone's face, someone's body, someone's legacy. And now they stand in courtyards, guarding nothing, watching everything. Not forgotten, just misunderstood. The dust in Rome is different. It's not just dirt, it's layers. A little from the time of Augustus, a bit more from the 800s, some from when Napoleon marched through, some from when tourists arrived with fanny packs and asked where the pizza was. It settles on everything, bridging centuries. A kind of physical memory, soft enough to brush off, but impossible to ignore. And then there are the churches. So many of them built directly on top of Roman buildings, some inside them. You walk through a marble column, and suddenly you're in a medieval chapel. Step into a crypt, and you're beneath an old pagan altar. Rome doesn't bury the past, it layers it, like a palimpsest, like a dream that wakes up speaking another language. Even in the modern city, Rome peeks out. A subway project unearths a fresco. A new hotel finds its foundation resting on an old bathhouse. A water main breaks, and a mosaic winks up from the mud. The city isn't haunted. It's alive, but very, very old. And the older something is, the more gently you have to walk through it. Rome is not a museum. It's a memory with plumbing. A place where past and present drink from the same fountains. Where a waiter might serve cappuccino on a marble slab once used by a Roman judge. Where a cat naps on a statue of Mars. Where the traffic jams are medieval in structure, but modern in volume. And maybe that's what makes it so comforting. Rome isn't preserved in amber. It's weathered, flawed, smudged, but it's still here. And if you lean close enough, the marble will tell you. You're standing where others have stood. You're breathing air I've already held. You're not the first to be tired, or hopeful, or lost, or in awe. So tonight, as you close your eyes, picture those ancient stones under the moon, the Colosseum casting its long shadow across empty streets, the broken pediments, the half faces, the columns that refuse to fall. No voices, just air, just time, just the hum of stories wrapped in dust. Rome is quiet now, but not empty. It echoes. And in that echo, you'll find the shape of everything that came before, and a whisper saying, "You're part of this too." By now, we've wandered through every corridor of Rome's long goodbye. Not a crash, not a cliff, but a soft, low burn. Centuries of gentle unraveling. And here, at the edge of that story, the question flickers. What does it mean when an empire doesn't end in flames, but in layers of dust? The world likes dramatic endings. The curtain falls, the lights go out, the hero shouts one last line into the void. But Rome didn't do that. Rome didn't collapse. It settled, like ash after a fire, like breath after weeping, like a marble statue too heavy to fall, so it simply stood still as time moved around it. And maybe that's the lesson, that most things don't end all at once. They slip, they forget, they sigh and keep going until one day you realize they become something else entirely. That's not failure, that's transformation. Rome teaches us that even greatness can get tired, that you can build roads to the ends of the earth and still lose your keys at home. That gold runs out, that laws can't hold back time, that temples can be turned into bakeries and no one will mind as long as the bread is fresh. It teaches us that survival isn't about staying the same. It's about knowing how to be reborn. A city becomes a church. A ruin becomes a classroom. A statue becomes a cat perch. Life moves in. Life moves on. The glory fades, but the echo keeps whispering. You don't need to be an empire to relate. You just need to be human, which means you've probably felt it too. That quiet erosion, that feeling that something old is slipping away. Not with drama, but with dust. A job that changed, a house that got quiet, a friendship that turned into memory. Rome knew that rhythm. Rome was that rhythm. And still, it stood. The empire burned slowly. And in that fire, it gave warmth. Books, ideas, cathedrals, constitutional law, Latin phrases no one can pronounce but still put on government buildings. It didn't end so much as it spread out, like candlelight across centuries. And if there's comfort in anything, maybe it's this, that nothing built with care ever truly disappears. It lingers, in stories, in ruins, in the way people still look at a map and say, all roads lead to Rome, even if they're standing in a parking lot in Ohio. Rome also teaches us patience, that you don't need to change the world in a day, that some walls take decades to build and 1,000 years to fall. That meaning grows in layers, brick by brick, line by line, word by whispered word. It teaches us that even in failure, there is dignity, that an empire can fall with grace, that the last emperor doesn't need to die in battle. He can go home, read a book, and feed the chickens. That power fades, but beauty remains. And perhaps most of all, Rome reminds us not to be afraid of endings, because endings are never just ends. They're compost, they're prequels, they're chapters waiting for the next voice to speak. Every fall is followed by something unexpected, a sunrise, a new idea, a new language built from old ones. Even ruins bloom, even silence echoes. So tonight, as you drift deeper, as your thoughts soften, and the day fades into dreams, remember this: the empire didn't die, it transformed, from marble to memory, from swords to stories, from imperium to idea. And ideas once lit burn slow, but they burn long. Rome was not a warning. It was a mirror, a teacher, a long, low note that still hums under history. And if you listen, you'll hear it even now, in arches, in laws, in lullabies, soft, ancient, still glowing. And now, here we are, at the end of the empire, at the edge of the map, at the final flicker of a flame that burned longer than anyone ever expected. Rome is quiet now, but she is not gone. She is resting. She is remembering. She is dreaming again. The marble has cooled, the dust has settled, the scrolls are closed, and the last footsteps echo into silence. But in that silence, something remains. A shape, a breath, a rhythm, slow, steady, familiar. Not a heartbeat, not anymore, but maybe something deeper. The sound of memory remembering itself. You can still walk the streets, still trace the cracks in the stone, still lean against the arches that hold up nothing and everything at once. Rome is a ruin, yes, but it is also a whisper, a lullaby, a cathedral made of time. There's no crown anymore, no emperor, no legions, but there is still the curve of the dome, the weight of the stone, the stories carved when no one can reach, but everyone can feel. And maybe that's what lasts. Not the power, not the palaces, but the feeling, the dream of what could be built, what could be shared, what could be made to last, even after the builders are gone. The eternal city, they called it. And maybe that was never meant to mean unchanging. Maybe it meant ever turning, ever transforming, ever echoing. A city that learns how to become itself again, in every new era, even when the world forgets its name. Because the truth is, Rome never stopped breathing. She just slowed down, softened, listened. She became stories. She became ruins. She became the place where people go to remember how big the world once was, and still could be. Now the tourists walk her bones. The bells ring from churches once filled with gods. The pigeons strut across altars that haven't been worshipped at in centuries. The modern city lives around the old one. Coffee brewed beside collapsed columns. Scooters zipping past stone lions who haven't blinked in 2,000 years. Life goes on. Rome watches. Rome dreams. And what do cities dream of? Perhaps the clang of a blacksmith at dawn. The laughter of children chasing one another down ancient alleyways. The quiet pride of architects laying the first stone of something that will last longer than they will. Maybe cities dream of the hands that built them, the voices that named them, the candles lit on winter nights to chase away the dark. And maybe, somewhere in that dream, Rome sees you listening, breathing slowly, lying still, in a room far away from the Tiber, but somehow not far at all. You who stayed until the end. You who wanted to know not just what fell, but why it mattered. Rome thanks you for that, in her quiet way, with broken arches and golden dusk, with dust that remembers, with a voice that says, you're part of this too. So now, let the dream rest. Let the candles burn low. Let the stones sleep. The empire has ended. The story has been told. And all that remains is stillness. Stillness and the knowing that even in collapse, there is beauty. There is continuity. There is peace. The city dreams again. And so can you. Close your eyes. Let the echoes fade. Let the dust settle. And sleep, safe, warm, in a world still shaped by the quiet fall of Rome.